Right, so last time we have created our first model, the task, and we've also made a migration for it. Now, at this point, our database table exists, but it is empty and we have no real way of adding anything to it, except maybe through the admin panel or any database management tool, but we don't really want to use that. I would like to show you how can we generate a set of some fake data that you can easily load to your database anytime you want. And you can also generate even thousands of fake records for your databases. And this can be achieved using a combination of tools called, first, model factories to provide the fake data for your models, and then seeding, which loads this into the database. Now, the factories and seeders can be found inside the database folder. So first, let's start with factories, as we kind of already have one and it was auto-generated by Laravel, and this is a factory for the user model. So basically, model factories provide a way to generate fake data for your database tables in Laravel, and they allow you to quickly populate your database with some sample data for testing or development purposes, like in our case. Now, you can create new model factories by using PHP Artisan make factory command, but also you can generate models together with those factories. We haven't created a factory for the task model, so then we'll make one for it. But before we do, let's see how a typical model factory looks like. So it's a class which has a method called definition, and then if you call your factory specific way, so it starts with the model name, there is a model user in our app, and then the suffix is factory, Laravel will just figure out that you mean a factory for the user model, so we don't really have to tell Laravel then for which model this factory is. So let's go back to the definition method. So this is the basic definition of what should you put into every single field of this database table. So you need to keep in mind that for optional fields you can skip them, but all the fields that are required, you need to come up with some kind of value. Now this fake function, this is using behind the scenes a library called Faker, which is a PHP library that lets you generate some fake data. For example, fake returns an object which has methods, and it can generate fake names, it can generate emails. Here we generate date. This here is storing a password which is hashed, so it would always be password in plain text. And then remember token is just generated using the built-in Laravel random function, which generates a random string. Now, apart from the basic definition, which specifies what all properties of all models should look like, so they should use some generators, you can have those factory variants like this unverified, which would take all the properties and would use all the properties the same way as in this definition method, with the exception that for every single model it will set this email verified at to null, so we can generate some unverified users. So those methods you can just come up on your own, you create them on your own, and then you just change a tiny set of properties to reflect some specific states that you need. So that's the model factory, that's the definition of how to generate some fake data for your model. And then there are seeders. So you can either have a couple of seeders or in small apps, it's enough to just have one, and Seeder is the actual place where you would load something into the database. So we can actually do it right away because it contains an example for the user model, which we already have. So you would use the model. It has the factory method, which lets you specify how many models you want to generate. And calling this create method then would create those models and then immediately store them inside the database. So to load this into the database, we need to run a command, which is php artisan db seed. Now we loaded something into the users table, so let's see. We should have 10 users with random names, random but unique emails, and they all have the same password but different tokens, etc., etc. So you need to keep in mind that this php artisan db seed command will always add new data to the database. So it's not refreshing the database in any way, it's not resetting the data, it always adds the data on top of the existing data. So as we already said, seeding is just a way to populate the database with some sample data using the model factories you have just defined. So seeding is typically done as part of the initial setup of Laravel application. When you install an already made app, you typically have an empty database. So seeding would help you, get started with a project that you have joined, for example. But also seeding is really helpful for local development, so you can define some sets of data, and then you also don't have to work on an empty database. So you can potentially define or see some performance bottlenecks if you define enough large data sets. So as you see, this might be really, really useful. Now you can create your own seeders, so you don't really have to have just one. It can be also done using php artisan make seeder command, and seeders have this run method which just always runs for every seeder, and basically seeder is responsible for loading the models into the database. All right, so in the meantime, we would like to create a factory for the model we've created, which is the task. So we run php artisan make factory. This would be task factory, and let's say that it is for the model task. So it should create a new file. The task factory. So as you see, the definition is empty. Now we have to fill it with, the definition. We have to specify how every single field of every new record should look like. Right, so our job is to add some value for every single field. So let's begin with the title. So we can use this fake function to get access to faker object. And I think that the title can be a sentence. You can either use functions or properties. Properties would just use default. Functions lets you specify some options if you like to customize how things are generated. Now let's go with description. This is also fake, and let's use a paragraph here. So this would generate a little longer text. Let me copy paste that and add long description. This is also, or maybe this time we'll use a function. So let it be a paragraph. How many sentences do we want? Let's make it 7. All right, let's set the second parameter to true and then completed. This is a Boolean, so let's also generate a random Boolean value. Let's use the property. So tasks would be randomly completed or not completed. Alright, so we have the task factory, but this won't load anything to the database yet. We need to go to the seeder, and then you can either import the model or just use a fully qualified namespace like so, app models /task. And one more thing you need to know, that if you want a factory for the model, it needs to use this trait has factory. This happens by default if you generate the model using artisan command, but if you would create it manually, well, you would need to remember about that. Okay, so this trait adds this factory method, and let's generate maybe 20 tasks, and let's call create. Later on, I will explain why we call this create method and what are the other options. Now save the changes, and now you have a couple of ways. You can either run PHP Artisan DB seed, which would just add some more data to the database. So if we do PHP Artisan DB seed, then if we take a look at users, instead of 10 users, we've got 20. And also we've got 20 tasks, but next time we run this command, we will have 40. So that's not always what you want. Instead, if you would like to completely refresh the database, basically reset it to the initial state and then just load some data using the seeder, you can instead run PHP Artisan migrate refresh --seed. So this flag, maybe let me start with the command first. So the command will basically run all the migrations down. So it will roll back all the migrations and run them again. This completely recreates the database. So I need to tell you that right now that that's a dangerous operation. You should only run it on the development environment, never ever on the production database, as it will basically wipe out your data. But then after recreating all the tables, it will just use the seeder to seed them with data. So let's run it right now. So as you see, it's rolling back the migrations, running the migrations again, and then seeding the database, which results in 20 tasks and 10 users every time, because this is what we have defined in our seeder. All right, so once we have all this data, next up we can learn how to load this data from the database. Now, since I've mentioned that we also have variants, let me use this variant. So let me show you how can you use a variant of a factory to load some different data. So to generate some models that would have this unverified state, which means that email verified add column would always be null, we'll do app models user factory. So we call the same factory method. I would like just 2 of those. Now we need to call this unverified method. So it's what we have added here. So whatever is the name of the custom state of the model in the factory, that's in our case unverified. So we call that here, and then we call create. So this would create an additional 2 models, which would just be unverified. So sometimes you have those cases where you need some specific models. Maybe some need to have lower prices, others need to have higher prices if, for example, you are loading real estate. So you can produce this kind of like mixed values for your model generation. So not every model is the same, which lets you produce different cases. So it's also easier to test how your application would behave in different circumstances. So once you have that, you run the PHP artisan migrate refresh with the seed flag, and then you can see that we've got 2 additional users, and this column is null for them, which confirms that everything has worked. Right, so this is how you load fake data into the database. Next up, we are gonna see how to actually load the data using models for our routes.